Hey everybody, welcome to another episode of Real People Real Estate, where we sit down with real people right here in Western Massachusetts doing awesome things in real estate. And today I am joined by Ben Palkowski with Old Colony Law, who is going to enlighten us on all things estate planning. How you doing, Ben?
Doing well. Thank you for having me, Lindsay. Appreciate it.
I'm so glad you could be here. And it's fun to do this. And Ben and I are part of a mastermind group, Pioneer Valley Mastermind. So for our listeners too, if that would help at all with your business, that could be a great way to connect.
No, absolutely. Yeah. Absolutely.
So tell me a little bit about your background first. Just you have Old Colony Law now in Amherst.
Yep.
What was going on before that?
Yeah, absolutely. And technically Hadley, but yeah, absolutely.
Oh, Hadley,
yeah, we're
okay.
kind of on the border
Yeah.
too. But yeah, so I co-own Old Colony Law with my wife, Claire. So she and I, we met in law school. The University of New Hampshire School of Law. We opened up our practice there coming out of the pandemic in summer of 22.
Okay.
So we're coming up on 5 years or so in our practice. Claire, my wife, she is really kind of more of the the estate planner, the true estate planner, the rock of our practice, if you will. My background, I'm also, in addition to being an attorney, I'm also a CPA.
That's
so
right.
my background is, I have a lot of tax background. Before and after law school, I worked in government relations. So I was up in Vermont primarily. I would represent clients before the Vermont legislature in connection with tax and healthcare legislation.
Yeah.
And that naturally evolved over the years into working with nonprofits. So I would work on fundraising. I would sometimes, basically set up, political organizations, nonprofit organizations.
Wow.
During the pandemic, when we were all kind of locked up in our houses, Claire and I were recalling how when we were in law school, we were talking about, maybe we'd do a firm together at some point. Her father had an estate planning law practice down in Connecticut. And then, so, during that time, we were all kind of locked down. We were just thinking, okay, let's just make this happen, right? And then, I think just kind of, Claire's not very strong, and she'll admit this in the tax area, right? And then, so I think, what I brought to the table kind of gelled well with her.
Sure.
Again, her being kind of the more kind of a traditional background in terms of trust and estates. I was able to bring that kind of tax expertise. And that really kind of brought me to a point where, what I really like about that is now I'm working, as part of the estate planning process with my clients. I'm working with them on their, charitable giving and their philanthropy. And I like working with that, and from that perspective now, because I'm able to work kind of more holistically with their clients, making sure they have a good impact, achieving tax avoidance. Whereas before, I was kind of just raise money now,
right.
which is great. Nonprofits are great. They need their money, and we really need to support them in our community. But working with the client's perspective and that kind of that broader picture is
that's awesome. You brought
great.
it all together
Yeah,
in a good partnership with Claire, in both ways, right? Marriage and work.
Indeed,
that's awesome.
Yeah.
So from the real estate perspective, so people who are maybe listening or viewing this show own some sort of property, residential, commercial, whatever, and oftentimes maybe have no estate planning at all. So where does someone start? And actually, even before that, can you just give a broad definition of estate planning?
Yeah, sure. So estate planning, it's really, kind of our definition in our office is really, it's the arrangement for the management and the disposition of your assets.
Okay.
And so by disposition, I mean the transfer of your assets.
Sure.
So how you're managing them during your lifetime, namely what we're primarily planning for is if something happens to you where you cannot manage your financial and property affairs on your own, how can you make sure you handle that within the confines of your own orbit of loved ones and professionals and not have to rely on court intervention? By disposition, I mean your property's going to go somewhere eventually, right?
Yep.
Whether it's gifting, right, to a family member, or maybe it's part of your charitable giving during your lifetime. But ultimately, if any assets that you own upon your death are going to transfer, right, through probate or through your estate plan, right?
Yep.
And so that's what we're managing for. And then in that context, it's not about to whom we're transferring, right? It's about, okay, how are we going to do it in a tax efficient manner? Are we going to do it in a way where we're going to make sure that our family wealth is going to be protected if we're going to pass it down to the next generation. So it's a bit of a three-dimensional chess game in that we have to look at what assets are in the picture, look at what's on the horizon, our given client circumstances with regard to their station in life, risk factors, et cetera.
And so let's just talk about for a second, if somebody doesn't have an estate plan and they can't manage their assets anymore or they've died, what happens in that case? Let's just focus on property since this is a real estate show. So just the real estate. So I own a home. I won't say I. Someone owns a home. Yesterday they died. They didn't have any estate plan. What happens to the property in that case, typically?
Yeah, and I would just pause there and say that technically speaking, we all have an estate plan, right? And the question is, are you going to go with one that you make? Or you're going to go with the one that's kind of set up for you. The law has one in place, right? There's statutes, what are called intestate statutes, that basically say, in the absence of you making a plan in some fashion, well, then here's what's going to happen.
Got it. Okay.
But really, what we have to look at is, how is that property, how is that house owned? Is it owned jointly with other people? In which case, generally, what will happen is, upon the death of one owner, the surviving joint owners will assume ownership. Is it owned by a trust by that deceased person? And then, frankly, what we look to at that point are the terms of the trust. Is it going to continue to be held in trust, or is the trust directing it to be disposed of in some other fashion? So you have to look at kind of how it's owned, who or what is owning it. You mentioned commercial real estate. So typically, in a business setting, the real estate will be owned maybe by a corporate entity or an LLC or something, and so then we have to look at within the confines of that business planning, right? Are there partners in this business, right? Is there, usually there's going to be some kind of transfer of ownership planned, right? In that context, and so we have to look at how it's owned, and is there a plan in place? Are there other owners?
What are the most typical pitfalls, if there are typical ones, that you see if somebody hasn't made their own estate plan and therefore are basically just subject to whatever the law is?
Yeah, there's a few. Lack of contingency planning. So I want my house to pass on to my spouse or my child, but my spouse or child is no longer here, right? Or maybe I don't have a spouse anymore. If you're listening, Claire, I love you. But
I know it's hard to talk about this. That's why I'm like, talk about someone else.
No, exactly. So the pitfall sometimes it's not completing the planning, right? Sometimes people will have the idea of, okay, I want to get my estate plan done, and they go to their lawyer. And then they get their documents, right? They sometimes you get a stack or a binder of documents. I have my trust, I have my will, check the box, I'm good to go. Oftentimes what we see is that we're not connecting the dots. And what I mean by that, okay, I have my trust document here, but is my house in that trust? Okay, so what we have to look at is, okay, is that house talking to that trust in some fashion? Usually that's going to be in the context of a deed, okay? I'm Ben Palkowski, I have my trust. In order to complete that planning, I might want to put my house into that trust, so I'll transfer it to myself as trustee of my trust. That's a huge pitfall. So people will say, I have my documents, that's great. They put it on the bookshelf, put it in their safe, they say I'm all done, but you have to make sure that the property you own is actually talking to your legal documents.
And that's where the planning and the long-term work and communication probably comes in to make sure that people are actually completing the plan they think they're completing.
Indeed, yes. And what we say all the time in our office is, your documents indeed are a part of the plan, right? But your documents in and of themselves are not the plan. Part of your plan is to make sure that your documents are updated. And again, that your various assets are actually talking to your legal documents.
So speaking of these documents, what types of documents are typically part of an estate plan?
A will. Of course, and I think a lot of us are familiar, at least loosely, with what a will is. Primarily what you're doing there is you're dictating the disposition of any assets that you own upon your death. Okay, who are they going to? What are they going to? If it's going in trust, for example. You're also appointing what's called in Massachusetts a personal representative. The more antiquated term that people might be familiar with is executor. So that is the person or persons that you're appointing to carry out your wishes. They have the legal authority, the fiduciary duty on behalf behalf of your estate and your fiduciaries to kind of carry out your wishes, right? These are trusted people, right? In the absence of kind of naming that person or persons in your will, it would be subject to potentially a court appointment. Okay. So that's number one. A will. In addition, you're going to want a power of attorney and a healthcare proxy. It goes back to what we were talking about earlier in terms of incapacity planning. With those types of documents, what you're doing is saying, okay, if I'm in a position where I cannot make or communicate healthcare decisions myself, who am I going to appoint? Who's going to be my healthcare agent to do that for me? Who is going to be my attorney in fact under my power of attorney to act on my behalf in connection with my business affairs, maintaining my house, renegotiating my mortgage, maybe dealing with my insurance company, all those types of things. If I'm not able to do that myself, I don't have my agent named, it would require sometimes expensive and intrusive court proceedings to get that done. So big things are will, power of attorney, healthcare proxy. Those are the, frankly, when without even knowing anything about a potential client, I just know that those three documents, they absolutely are must-haves. We get calls in our office all the time where people say, "Hey, I need a will," and I say, "I know you do. I knew that already before you called, right?" And then so the question becomes, what goes in this will? What else do you need? Do you need a trust with the will? And that's usually kind of where the conversations go. Do you need a trust together with, with those kind of foundational documents, as we call them?
And I think it's interesting, at least, in my day job where I'm helping people with homes and mortgages, a lot of times people don't have any planning. And also they think, well, I don't have any money, or I don't have any assets, or why would I need a will? I'm not rich enough. So everything that you're saying makes sense, because I think people don't always know that if they don't make the plan's just going to happen to them and their loved ones either way, through whatever legal means it has to happen. And that can be really tough when something gets, like we talk about in housing, something's tied up in probate and it's stuck there and waiting on a court decision, it sounds like, from what you're saying.
Yeah, potentially, yeah. And an upshot to having, people ask all the time, I want to put a house in a trust, right? And then, depending on what you want to accomplish, that makes a lot of sense. Most of our clients end up, doing that, putting their house, their residential real estate, into a trust for one purpose or another, ultimately. And what we'll do is we'll talk with clients about kind of, okay, what are your ultimate goals? Does it make sense? Do you need a trust to accomplish this? Okay. Like I said, most of our clients end up having that, but we'll weigh the pros and cons. Sometimes it's an absolute, we'll steer them in that direction because that's our counsel here. But yeah, we just have to look at that. We just have to look at that bigger picture there. We have to look at kind of, what are other risk factors, right? Sometimes people envision having their family home passed down to the next generation, right? And so, sometimes what they're talking about, is making sure that their legal planning is not disjointed from the practical planning, okay? So if you want your house to pass down to your child, that's great. But if they're in California, are they even interested in this? Is this asset just going to sit there and kind of depreciate in value because no one's living in it, no one's renting it out, right? And so sometimes we have to make sure that the we can do all the legal planning. We're trust attorneys, but we like to make sure that the legal planning is congruent with the reality.
The reality, yeah, exactly. Is there a certain threshold of wealth, maybe, where a trust definitely makes sense?
Yes, I mean there's not necessarily a line at which, okay, well after this number, you need a trust. But in Massachusetts there's a fairly low estate tax exemption. Massachusetts is one of 12 states that imposes an estate tax, sometimes called a death tax, on its citizens upon their death. And so in Massachusetts, if you're above a $2 million mark, that estate tax exemption, that's where the estate tax kicks in. I mention all that because for most people who are owners of real estate, that comprises the bulk of their estate, if not a majority, a substantial part of it. If you think about it, $500,000 house, right? Which is pretty modest these days around here. That's already 25% of your taxable estate. And so sometimes when people think about estate tax, it's just kind of like, oh, well, I don't have a lot of money in the bank, a lot of investments. That may be true, but what we're looking at is the totality of your asset holdings, which includes liquid and non-liquid assets.
And then what's that estate tax level federally?
Right now it's 15 million, and it's adjusted for inflation annually. So most people don't need to worry about that. I mean, a very small amount of our clients, frankly, need to worry about that.
Let's hope we have to worry about it someday, right?
Right. No, exactly, exactly. And but the thing is, both federally and here in Massachusetts, there's been a fair amount of change in recent years, and so every time Congress gets back, to DC, they kind of change their mind or we're going in a different direction, and so which is why it's always imperative to kind of re-examine your plan. Usually for people, it's not a one and done kind of deal because I mean, sometimes there's factors within your family that might alter your plan, but sometimes there's things out of your control, based on what Congress does or a decision a court makes or a regulation the IRS puts out. So.
What are the most common revisions that you make, or what would you suggest people keep on the top of their mind? Because you're totally right. People make their documents and they sit somewhere and you forget where they are, or now even so they sit in the cloud somewhere, right? So it's not even necessarily a physical reminder to go.
Yeah, no, indeed. Yeah. So sometimes there are things what I might call, say, triggering events. So if there's someone kind of in the core nucleus of your family who has died, that's certainly something there. If there's been a divorce, if you've divorced your children, there's a health incident, long-term care incident. If there's anything, kind of in your family, anyone that you've named in your documents, you're going to want to look at that. If your wishes have changed, right? Presumably your documents are going to be a reflection of your wishes. Right. So if your wishes or your circumstances have changed, it's always a good idea to dust off your documents, take a look at everything, reset. Frankly, I tend to think for most people, look, at the end of the day, 70% of people don't do this a first time. Ideally, I'd love to say every year, at tax time, maybe while you're looking at this financial stuff, maybe reminder. You look, it makes sense. But the reality is people aren't going to do that for the most part. But again, part of the planning process, in our office, we like to make sure that clients typically leave having some guidance when to kind of update. And in the absence of a triggering event, our soft rule of thumb is don't let 5 years go by without taking a look at things. Because naturally, when 5 years have gone by, something is going to have gone on in your life, okay? Or naturally, something has been changed in the law, okay? So 5 years is a good rule. More often the better. And look, sometimes people think that every time I review my documents, I have to update everything. That's not necessarily true. Sometimes you can do a spot check. Sometimes, we don't need to throw out everything from a legal perspective. We can do a nice discrete amendment, and it's fine. But doing that spot check
makes sense.
Somewhat routinely makes sense.
So at least every 5 years, if not more
that's
often,
again soft
sense.
Rule of thumb. Yeah.
So you do such a great job at hosting your, I don't know if they're weekly or bi-weekly, but updates that you send out to your database. Yeah. So what do you think most recently, as far as tax changes or law changes, have been most impactful on your estate planning?
Yeah, I mean, I just think it's not necessarily one specific law necessarily. I think it's more broadly just the larger uncertainty, in the direction we're headed with the economy, government, right? Just kind of this larger discussion we have in general. What we've been seeing a lot lately is just kind of people just want to make sure that their own decisions are kept within their family. They don't want government intrusion. By government intrusion, I mean, unnecessary taxes, courts weighing in where they don't have to, kind of interfering with healthcare decisions and so forth. And, we see that a lot because I think the way I see it is, estate planning, is kind of at the core of some of our fundamental rights, right? And if you're thinking about, kind of our property rights, right? Our privacy rights, this is at the core of estate planning. And if you think about, our free speech rights, your will literally is your last word, right? We think about, we even have gun owners, right? Sometimes, Charlton Heston, out of my cold dead hands, I say, why settle for that, right? Let's just make sure everything is being passed properly, right? I think estate planning is at the core of some of our most intimate aspects of our lives, family. We talk about faith sometimes. We talk about, sometimes we're talking about children out of wedlock. Sometimes we're talking about embarrassing things. We're talking about healthcare. And so it's just deeply, deeply personal, to people. There's a lot of barriers out there. There's confusion. There's predatory marketing, and so forth. And so just, there's a lot of barriers out there, and it's just like, we hear, this is why we really lean in our office to this aspect of the law. I mean, we don't do really, family law, litigation, personal. We really focus on this because we just think it's, just so important. It's important the notion of having an estate plan, not just like having a will just to check the box, to make sure you have a plan.
Yeah. Well, and something else that you do on your team, I know, is you'll do kind of an assessment, which I think is really nice for service too. Speaking of barriers or just people feeling a little uncomfortable to just start the process, I think that's a really nice opportunity that you give to folks to just have a one-on-one and do an assessment, and it's a good way to see what's going on and what really fits.
Absolutely. Sometimes, again, and I get it. People don't like to pay lawyers. I get it, right? I get it. And I really get that. And so sometimes I think one of the obstacles to estate planning is people think that, I'm going to have to go spend thousands of dollars on an expensive plan that I frankly don't need. I'm going to be gone anyway, right? And look, I get that, right? What we encourage people to do is just have that consultation. Let's just sit down. In just sitting down for an initial consultation, sometimes we're able to kind of just, even if we're not engaging with the client, steer them in the right direction. Look, you don't want to do this right now, but at least take a look at this issue you have on your life insurance or your beneficiary designation on this account or your IRA, or we'll flag issues for them. I mean, just in a consultation, frankly, we have counsel people to make corrections. I've saved, frankly, thousands of dollars issues that would have slipped through the cracks in terms of the spot checking documents, beneficiary designations, and so forth, making sure assets are titled properly.
What are the most common, I mean, you're naming some already, but what are other common pitfalls that you see, or just oversights that you see? So sometimes,
sometimes it's not even just pitfalls. Sometimes it's missed opportunities too. Sometimes people are missing out on mechanisms to optimize their situation. We serve a lot of business owners, right? So sometimes, the business owner sometimes is a big breadwinner in the household, perhaps. So we're going to have all, they naturally have all the assets in their name, but meanwhile, maybe the spouse is a homemaker, maybe has a regular W-2 job, maybe doesn't have a lot of risk exposure. So let's talk about in the estate plan. Let's put some of those assets in the spouse's name, right? So from an asset protection standpoint, as part of your estate planning, you can kind of provide some protection there, right? Why would you put, if I'm an engineer, right, or something like that, maybe subject to potential litigation on a project later, why would I expose all my assets? Let's just kind of let's just be creative about your planning. Again, it's not just about having documents, right? It's just making sure the assets are managed properly. Like I said, definition of estate planning, right? Like at the top, you were asking me, it's not. We always, we hear the word estate and we think death, right? But it's also about the management of assets during your lifetime, as well, making sure they're protected.
Absolutely. Do you have any stories that stick out in your mind, any experiences where you feel like you really were able to help one of your clients figure out their plan in a way that benefited them?
Absolutely. This is where you have to have, I think, like a little bit of emotional intelligence, read the room a little bit. This is where we'll accommodate this. We don't love doing Zoom meetings. We love to see people, our clients, in the flesh because, again, like I was alluding to before, our conversations with clients can take an emotional turn, right? And sometimes you have to read that. And so I can think of a few times where we're asking naturally, about, our clients, kind of family constellation, as we call it, right? The children, their respective spouses, their career path, anyone's alienated from the family, any threats, et cetera. We like to kind of take the temperature on those things. And sometimes, we're talking about their children's spouses, for example, and there's some, an element of discomfort there. And as we unpack the situation, we're realizing, maybe for one reason or another, the client doesn't want to come out and say it, but the issue is they don't want their child's inheritance potentially going to a future divorcing spouse. well, then you know what? Let's just plan accordingly on that, right? And we
Right.
can set up a trust that can play defense against that, right?
Yeah.
And that's something that we see more, quite commonly. Sometimes that's a stated concern. People come in, but sometimes for religious reasons or family value reasons or one reason or another, it's an uncomfortable thing to actually come out and say.
Yeah.
And so that's where we can provide value as an attorney. We have a duty of confidentiality. Nothing leaves the four corners of our conference room in terms of aspects about your life, your finances, your family that you put on the table. We really need to know all of this so that we can serve you better.
Yeah.
Because I kind of half jokingly say this, but it's true. I mean, at Old Colony Law at our office, we're not Disney World, but we do make your wishes come true, right? Our job is to give full legal effect to your wishes, right?
Right.
And, yeah.
Absolutely. Yeah. Well, thank you for making estate planning a little bit more, attainable for everyone to understand. As we wrap up, any last suggestions that you have for people or anything that you want to just myth bust or anything about estate planning?
Yeah. No, I mean, I would just, encourage folks to, do a little research on estate. But look, we have Google. There's, dabble into it, right? Learn about what it is if you haven't done it before, okay? If you have a plan, okay, take a look at it. We have a lot of clients, frankly, who have an old plan from when they first had their kids back in 2005 or 2000 or something. And here we are 20 years later. It's a whole set of circumstances. The kids are grown up and, we have to look at that thing. So even if you already have a plan, don't just say, hey, I did my estate planning in 2009. I'm all set, right? We hear that a lot. Just make sure it still is a reflection of your circumstances and your wishes.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. Dust those documents off the shelf, right? Don't just let them sit there. Exactly. Well, thank you, Ben. I really appreciate your time.
Thank you.
This was great. And thanks to our viewers and listeners who tuned in today to Real People Real Estate. Hope that you learned a lot about estate planning from Ben with Old Colony Law, and we'll see you in a couple weeks.